All right, so here we are for the 9-patch quilt along. I'm so excited to be starting this quilt along, and I hope that you are too. So today we're going to be working on the 9-patch block for this quilt. And if you missed the introduction to this quilt along that was posted 2 weeks ago, I'll link that video down in the description. It has all the fabric requirements for this quilt, and kind of I go on into the layout of how this quilt along will be formatted. So today we're going to be working on this 9-patch. We'll be sewing 50 of these, and I know that sounds like a lot, but they do come together very quickly. So let's jump in and get started on it. All right, so this is the way the 9-patch block is going to kind of look. I'm not going to try to get this uniform of colors on this block when I do it for the rest of this quilt, but it just kind of gives you an idea of what a 9-patch looks like. So if you remember from the first video, I did talk about that I'm going to be using a jelly roll to put this together. Now, if you're using a fat quarter, here's what your fat quarter likely looks like. You have like a selvage end, and then the end that would be kind of the middle of that bolt roll of fabric. So if I were you, to make it a little bit easier following along, I would cut your 2.5-inch strips along where the selvage is at one end, because then it'll kind of mimic a jelly roll. So for the jelly roll, I'm going to be pulling out 30 strips from it. So for you to have about the same amount of options from your fat quarters, you'll be wanting to cut 60 2.5-inch strips. So I'm going to pick out 30 of these jelly roll strips. So I'm going to save this one. Now you are going to need to keep 13 of these strips to the side for the snowball block that we'll be doing later. So I'm going to pick out 30 of these, and then we'll meet back up and take a look at everything. All right, so now that I've chosen my strips, what I'm going to do is kind of separate them out into groups of 3 that have a nice variety in color. So I'll want, like, you know, see how these two, they're not the same colors, but they do have the same design. So I wouldn't want to put those together in a group. So I like this with the nice dark blue and red. So maybe I'll find like a green to go in here. And this one will work nice because not only is it a different color, but the patterns are all different sizes too. You see how these have the nice larger flowers? This has small polka dots, and these kind of have the medium-sized cherry. So I really like these 3 together. So I'm going to set these to the side and keep doing that with all of this fabric. So I'm going to go ahead and figure out a nice way to get all of these together in groups of 3. All right, so I have a nice variety of all these picked out into groups of 3. So what I'm going to be doing now is one at a time, I'm going to be sewing these together lengthwise. So what that will look like is I'm going to be taking them, laying them right sides together, and sewing a 1/4-inch seam right along the length of these strips. Then when I get it together in 2 strips sewn together, I'll add the 3rd one on. So you could kind of lay them out and see, like, what do you think the best order should be? Which one would be the middle? I'm not going to think that deeply into it. I'm just going to sew them together because this is meant to be a very scrappy quilt. Now, we all have personalities, so if you do want to spend a little bit more time thinking about it, that is okay. So I'm going to go ahead and get one of these sewn together, show you what it looks like, and then we will talk about how we're going to be cutting these after getting these 3 strip sets sewn together. So here I just have my strips right sides together, and I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam lengthwise across the 2 strips. Once I get to the end, I'm going to add on the next strip so that I'll have all 3 of these strips sewn together. So again, they're just right sides together, and I'm sewing a 1/4 inch seam down the length of the strips. All right, so here is what these strip sets will look like. I have 2 different strip sets here. So here's one of them, and here's the other. And remember, we're going to be sewing 10 of these strip sets. So you're going to have 10 strip sets that are 3 of these jelly roll strips sewn together. Now, before we cut these, let's talk about how I pressed them. So like I said, there's 10 of these strip sets, and I'm going to press 3 of them into the center. So 3 different strip sets are going to be pressed to the center block. And then the rest of them, 7 of them, are going to be pressed where the center seams are pressed out to the outside. Now, this is because it'll make it a lot easier for these to all nest together. So let's take a look at that demo block I showed you before. So this is the middle strip set. So this set of 3 blocks here, and you can see how it's pressed into the center block. And these 2 strip sets, the seams are pressed out. So because they are pressed in different directions, see the outside one's pressed out and the inside set pressed in, this makes it where the seams nest together nicely and we don't have a lot of bulk here. So it lays nice and flat when it is pressed. So let's go ahead and start cutting these strips. All right. So what we're going to be doing now is cutting these into 2.5 inch strips. Now, if you're loving this fabric, I don't think I pointed out that this is Catalina. So that is the fabric line I'm using from Fig Tree & Company. Fig Tree & Company, oh my goodness, they always have the most gorgeous fabric, don't they? So to cut these down into those 2.5 inch strips, this is what I like to do. I like to square up one side of it. So you see how these kind of ended up at all these different lengths? You're not really going to be able to cut nice even strips from that if they're all different lengths. And then I just line up my ruler with that freshly cut side, and I lined it up with the 2.5 inches and cut it. So I'll cut all the way down this. I should be able to get 16 of these little strip sets like this. So I'm gonna stack all those up there. I'm just gonna keep cutting through these. So you see, I'm just gonna line them up here. And then when I get some of my others cut, I can start rearranging them and decide how I want all these 9 patches to come together. I really think that these 9 patch quilt blocks are a really great beginner quilt block. And I don't know if you know this, but when I started quilting, I loved to look into like where the different quilt blocks came from and all that. And I had found out that the 9 patch originated here in America, actually, during the early part of the 19th century. I thought that was so interesting that it actually started here. Well, here in America. Some of you may not be listening from here in America, but it was a really valued quilt block because of the simplicity. So you could teach really young kids how to do these quilt blocks, and it was really easy for them to piece it together. And of course, you know, early pioneer women would be able to use scraps in this way. You know, they could cut a whole bunch of whatever size pieces they wanted to cut and just slowly start building a quilt together. You could get a few of these together. If you had 9, sew them together into a 9 patch and then keep building on it to put a quilt together. And you could keep building on it until it got to the size you wanted. If you wanted it to fit a bed, or if you wanted it for, you know, like a larger bed or a kid's small bed, a small baby quilt, you could just build these 9 patches until it got to the size you wanted. And back then, you know, sewing when you were on the prairie, living the prairie life, it was an essential skill. So kids were taught it really, really young. I mean, a lot of these young kids would learn to sew and sew quilt blocks together before they could even read. I just thought that was so fun and interesting when I read that. I read in one article that this 9-patch block was taught to kids as young as 3 or 4 years old. Some of them would even be, you know, very skilled at piecing this block together by the time they were 5 years old. And I just thought that was incredible, because I didn't learn how to sew even on a sewing machine, which is such, like, even easier to sew on a sewing machine, I think, than to sew by hand. I didn't learn how to do that until I was a teenager. So I just thought that was incredible that some of these kids would be proficient at sewing a block like this together even when they were 9 years old. So if you don't think you can do this, know that you can, now that you know a little bit of the history of a 9-patch. So I'm going to see how many I have here. So I have 1, 2, 15, 16. So I almost got 17 out of it, because if you saw, I cut one more, but I have a little bit of selvage here. So what I'm going to do is grab my little add a 1/4 inch tool ruler and see if it might still work. And it looks like I could probably still squeeze this into the quilt and not have any of that white selvage there show. So I have all of these ready to go, and I just need to do the same thing with the rest of those strips that I have. So I'm going to get all those sewed together, and like I said, I'm going to sew 2 more of those strip sets and press them into the middle block like on this one, and the rest I'm going to press out. I may need to adjust some of them, but it's much easier to cut these strip sets while the block's already pressed. It's a little bit easier to even them out. So I'm going to get the rest of them ready, and then we'll look at how we sew the rest of this 9-patch together. All right, so now that I have all of my strip sets cut, I am going to plan out the 50 blocks that I want to sew. So here are all my middle strip sets. You can see they are all pressed to the center. So I have them all organized like that so that I know that I'm going to be able to sew these together quickly. So those are all pressed to the center. Then my ones on the top, the center block is pressed out. And then the ones down here are pressed out as well. So what I'm going to do is just lay them out, see if I like it. And, you know, if I don't like this layout as much, maybe I could turn one of them a different way, see if I like that. I'm not going to spend too much time stressing over how they're laid out, because this is, again, a scrappy quilt. But that's just going to kind of be my process, because maybe I don't want, you know, if 2 of these plaids end up right next to each other, that's mainly what I'm going to be looking for. So I'm just going to keep laying these out and kind of see what might work out nicely. So just going to keep laying some out. See here, I don't want all these really dark blues lined up together. So maybe I'll look and see if I have something else. Like I have this one with the red, and you know, I don't really like these 2 being together, so I'll just go ahead and grab a different one and see if that works out a little bit better. So that's going to be kind of my plan for getting 50 of these planned out. Now, once I get them all planned out, I'm going to sew the blocks together. So let me go ahead and show you how I am going to do that. So when I'm over at the sewing machine, I'm going to take my top strip and lay it lined up on the middle strip. And then I'm going to kind of use my fingers to press them and make sure that the seams are nested together nicely. If you want, here you could put some pins in at the seam, and that will hold it in place for you while you sew. So I'm going to go ahead and sew along this seam so they are right sides together, the seams are lined up nicely, and I'm just going to sew a 1/4 inch seam across here. All right, so now my top and my middle strip set are sewn together. Now, if you get all mixed up, if you're sewing a lot of these at one time, you can always remember your middle strip set is the one that has the seams pressed toward that middle square. So now I just need to add on the bottom strip. So I'm just going to lay that right sides together on the middle and do the same thing. I'm going to line up, can kind of move it with my fingers and see that the seams are nicely meeting. It's nice and flat through there. We don't have a lot of bulk because both the seams are pressed in opposite directions. I can put some pins in there. And then I'll just sew 1/4 inch seam across there. And I typically will pull out my pins before I get to them. Sometimes I miss them because I'm sewing fast and not paying attention, but it's usually good practice to not sew over them. So there's my first 9 patch. And then I'll just be pressing these seams. You could press them open. You could press them to the middle. I think I'm going to press them like out. I think that'll work best with the snowball block we'll be making next week. So there is the 9 patch. I'm going to get some more of these sewn together. Well, 50 of them to be precise. So get 50 of these blocks sewn up. I'm not going to keep pinning them. I will typically get it lined up nicely, feel it with my fingers, and just sew across here to save time with not having to put pins in. But definitely do what feels comfortable to you. If it is really important for you to have these lined up perfectly, then you probably want to put pins in. You don't always get it exact doing it this way and just kind of winging it, but I'm okay if they're not perfect, to be honest. So for me, that's fine. But everybody's going to have a different preference on that. So do what feels best and the most comfortable for you. And if you need them to be perfect points there, then go ahead and pin them. All right, so here is another 9 patch, and I'm gonna go press these and we'll take a look at them. All right, so here are 2 of the finished 9 patches, and they are so adorable. I am loving this fabric, and I cannot wait to see these all come together. Now, these should finish at 6.5 inches square. So if you wanna trim yours up to make sure they're absolutely perfect, you can go ahead and do that. That's not typically how I work. That is a lot of work for me. I don't mind doing it when absolutely necessary, like with half square triangles or something like that. But for this, mine lined up pretty square, so I'm okay. So this is a demo snowball block. It's going to be one of the ones that go alternating between here. The way these are going to line up, I think I can finagle them into place if needed, but if you like more accurate blocks, definitely trim these up to 6.5 inches. That's just not the life I live. I would much rather just maneuver it and make it work, and so be it. but you know, everybody has a different personality. So these should finish at 6.5 inches. And next week we will be working on those snowball blocks. Now, just to show you, I did press my seams into the center block, and I'm going to do that on all of these. Now, the only reason I ended up doing it that way is because I did take this demo block where I pressed the seams toward the patterned outside triangles, which I'm going to do on the other ones just because I like that seam being away from the lighter fabric where you can often see it. I went ahead and put these together and kind of felt along the seam to see if one way kind of reduced bulk more than the other. And either way that you press it, you're going to be going over seams on either side, no matter which way you press it. So I just went, I just ended up pressing them in because that felt good. If you prefer pressing them out, I think either way it will work, or you could press them each the same direction. On this block, I don't think it matters either way, just so you know. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and get the rest of these put together. I'm just gonna randomly sew them together into my 9 patches so that I can have 50 of these ready. And next week we'll be working on that snowball block. So I think that is going to be a lot of fun, and you'll finally be able to start laying these out and see how it's all going to look with the fabrics you chose. Now, if you get some of your 9 patches finished and you are in my Facebook group, I would love to see how yours are turning out. I'd love to see the colors you chose, the patterns you chose. I'm so excited to see those photos. If you're not already in the Facebook group, you can go ahead and join if you would like, if you have Facebook. I'll put a link to it down in the description. So thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next week. And I'll share, of course, my 9 patches in the Facebook group as I finish more of them. And I will show them to you next week before we start on the snowball block. All right, you guys, thanks so much for joining the sew along. I am having so much fun, and I'll see you next week. Bye.